Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and my topic today is one that you may not recognize, and it's also a little bit complicated and is itself ambiguous. The topic or topics are ambiguous loss and ambiguous grief. Probably not terms you've come across. Like grace you've come across, loss you may have come across, but ambiguous loss, ambiguous grief. What's that about? Well, let's find out. Now, the term ambiguous loss came about eventually through the work of psychologist Pauline Boss in the 1970s, who was working with the widows, or the wives, I should say, of servicemen, the United States servicemen, who were missing in action in Vietnam, I guess. But whose bodies had not been found, and so they couldn't be declared dead, but they were missing, and it was ambiguous. Were they alive or dead? I mean, maybe they were captured and were prisoners of war, and the other side had not released their names. Or maybe they were dead and their bodies just had not been recovered. So their loss to the wives was ambiguous. They didn't know whether they should grieve their death or not, because they might not be dead. And they couldn't go on with their lives. They couldn't, for example, get remarried because they couldn't be declared official widows, and they didn't know. Like maybe they were still married, but their husbands were in prisoner of war camps and might come home. And that's a quite common phenomenon. I mean, in fiction, it's represented by the Tom Hanks movie Castaway. And generally speaking, I don't watch the movie all the way through. In fact, I've rarely watched the movie all the way through. I'm not particularly interested in how he survived on a desert island. I mean, I'm sure it's interesting to some people, but it's not very interesting to me. But I do watch quite commonly the tail end. Where he comes back and his fiancée is remarried and has a kid, and then they eventually reunite. But what are they going to do? And what's she going to do? You know, the love of her life has returned, but everyone declared him dead. And on the plane on the way back from his place where he was cast away, one of his friends tells him about how they had a funeral and they had a coffin, and he asked, well, what did you put in the coffin? And they said, well, things that we remembered, but and then all of a sudden he comes back, and she just doesn't know what to do with it. She has ambiguous grief. Grief for something that isn't lost. But she still has the feeling of grief, because as far as she's concerned, it is lost. And he has ambiguous grief also, because his love of his life is also lost, but she's physically there, so it's ambiguous. All right. Well, that's the underlying context. So how does that apply to real life? Well, there are several possibilities, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but just give you some idea, because in general, what we can say is that this concept, or these concepts, are feelings that for a long time we didn't have a name for, but they were real, and we didn't. Now I don't know that having a name for these feelings helps, but I'm inclined to believe it does, because we can then go to a therapist, or we can go to literature that tries to address these issues that were not addressed before, but not because we didn't have a name for them, but because we didn't have a category for them. It's not just the loss of name; it's the loss of the idea that is important. Well, one of these possibilities is what is now called ghosting. Right? You have a relationship, seems to be going well, everything's fine. Maybe you're very intimate or whatever, and then all of a sudden the person just disappears, and don't know where they've gone. They've just vanished. Can't call them on the phone, can't visit them. They're gone. Well, that would be a form of ambiguous loss leading to ambiguous grief. Is the person present or not? They're not present in your life anymore, and they once were, but there's no closure. There's no sense that, okay, this relationship has ended. See, the thing is with what we would call non-ambiguous grief or non-ambiguous loss, it's something like a death. Like I'm a widower, my wife died, all right, so we had a funeral and all the rituals associated with that, and whatnot, and I suffered grief about it for a long time. In fact, in some ways I still do, but it's not ambiguous. She's not here, and I was with her when she died. She died in my arms. So that part is finalized. I can come to terms with that and move on. But I've got parishioners, or did have parishioners, I should say, one in particular, whose husband was in a vegetative coma. And she would come to church on Sunday mornings, and then Sunday afternoon she would go and visit him at it was a nursing home actually, in the village where I was pastor, and I went with her a couple of times to visit her husband, who was still alive, but I mean you could see him, he was breathing, and occasionally made noises, occasionally even opened his eyes, but he's not there. For all intents and purposes, he's dead, but his body, like his living body, is still there. So that's a form of ambiguous loss, like a person who is gone, but he's still there. So we can see two sides. We can see like the side of a person who's physically there but not psychologically there, versus somebody who still feels psychologically here but is physically not here. And in either case, you don't really understand it. And I suspect that we've all experienced something of the sort over our lives, one way or another, where a situation has changed, but we don't we don't have control over how it's changed or why it's changed, and in consequence we have no closure. Well, how do you deal with that? There are a lot of ways to do it. The common way that you'll see put on social media, for example, is to go to a therapist who understands that particular circumstance, or what I wouldn't say particular circumstance, but has some grasp of ambiguous emotions. Or you can read about it. There are actually quite a few papers have been written on it. It started in the 1970s with the work of Pauline Boss, but since then has multiplied considerably, to the point where you can easily read about the kinds of things you could do to cope. One of the mechanisms that a therapist once discussed with me that I thought was interesting was the idea of talking to a person who was absent but who you still have unfinished business with by talking to a chair. And it reminds me way back, I don't know if any of you will remember when Clint Eastwood was talking to the GOP when Obama was up for re-election, and he was talking on a microphone, and next to him was an empty chair, and he was directing all of his negative attention to the empty chair as if it were Obama. Well, that's the idea of the empty chair therapy. You imagine the person is there, and you express the feelings that you have as if the person were there, so that you have some sense of closure. Now, I'm not sure that works, because the point of closure is to have the other person respond, is to say, so you can say, look, I still feel, let's just say a lover who's abandoned you and you don't know why. The true closure, in my opinion, I'm not a psychologist, so not a professional opinion, but the closure would come in a true sense if you can sit down with the person and express your feelings, and that other person can express their feelings, and you can say, okay, all right, so you don't love me anymore, you've had a change of heart, and you're sorry, but blah blah blah, and I really miss you, and you can talk it through, and you're still going to feel bad, but you've got a feeling like, yeah, it has definitely ended, as opposed to the person just vanishing, and you're left wondering, and all I have to say to all of you who have a sense of ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss is I feel for you, because I've had those experiences myself, in various ways, and the final one that I want to talk about, not extensively, but I want to just think about, is the grief that you feel when expectations for a future don't come to pass. And that can also happen in a lot of different ways. Maybe let's say think about my retirement. I'm retired. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people in my situation who've retired thinking, okay, I've worked hard all my life at a job that I hated, but I've now accumulated a nice nest egg. I've got a pension, maybe I've got some Social Security and all of that, and I'm not happy. I thought that when I got to 65 or whatever age, and I could quit the job I didn't like, and I could, play tennis or golf or relocate to somewhere where I could go to the beach every day or whatever, and you find like you're not happy. Okay, well that's a form of ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief. A grief is something that isn't there. Now I don't, I don't feel that because I'm very very busy in my retirement. I live in Cambodia where the sun's always shining. Well, not always shining. Sometimes it's pouring down rain in the monsoon. But generally speaking, the weather hovers around 32, 33 degrees Celsius. That's in the upper 80s Fahrenheit in the day. I ride my bicycle around, do photography. I'm publishing a lot. I'm doing videos. So my retirement is fine. But what about a marriage where you look at the marriage and you think, at some point, like the kids have grown up and left, and we're together now. Maybe that would be a really nice time for us to get back to how we were when we were first in love and first married. And it's not like that. That it's just sort of humdrum. You get up, you go to work or you do something, come home, have dinner, watch television, go to bed. It all just doesn't seem like something that you were expecting. You had a vision of the future that you were confident was coming, and it didn't arrive. And that can be ambiguous grief. You're grieving for a loss of something that never happened. So it's ambiguous, and I think we all have those experiences. A relationship that just didn't work out the way we expected it. I think you've got to be a bit delusional if you think that a relationship is perfect and it's always going to last in a perfect way. You're missing something there. But or maybe like living for a very long time, thinking that you will have a committed relationship, you'll find your soulmate, you'll find the one, and you'll be able to settle down with that person. But instead, you have to either settle for somebody who is less than what you expected, or maybe no one at all. And here you are now in middle age or old age, and you expected to be living your life out with somebody that you cared about, but instead you have no one. I hope I'm not depressing you too much, but these are all very common feelings, and they all need to be addressed. That's the most important point that I want to make to you, is that these are real feelings, and if you can put a name to them, if you can put a category on them, you can begin to address them. And I hope that if you do have ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief, that you do address those problems and come out the other side. So I'm going to get back to the streets of Phnom Penh on Friday. I think I've been doing a lot more videos, but I wanted to do this one because it's an important one. And so I hope you tell your friends particularly about this one. I really want this to be a popular video. So please like, please subscribe, please tell your friends, and I will be back on Friday. Have a good week.